sort of sticking with Chelsea now that they have come up. Obviously, a lot going on there as well. And I wanted to first of all get your opinion on the appointment of Enzo Maresca, because that caught a lot of people off guard. A lot of us felt Poch might go, but nobody was talking about him. How did that come about, in your opinion? And how does the future look for Chelsea with him at the helm?
Well, I think from day one, Enzo Maresca was on the Chelsea shortlist, so there was no real surprise that they moved for him. And even though we heard a lot of smoke about Ruben Amorim, Chelsea never approached him in this process. So there was no talks with Amorim. Xavi leaving Barcelona didn't change anything. And the 3, or some say 4 on the shortlist, if we include Roberto De Zerbi, all had one thing in common, which is experience in English football and in the Premier League. And I know Maresca hasn't managed yet in the Premier League, but obviously because he's a Pep disciple, he's got plenty of experience within Premier League football. And Chelsea were looking for a young, by coaching standards, progressive, dynamic coach that is very heavy on possession. And the fact that he's a Pep disciple, I know Chelsea fans have already nicknamed him Diet Pep, which I found quite amusing. That's a bonus. But I don't think Chelsea's ownership are so glib as to say we just want somebody that is basically like Pep. And there are some points of stylistic and personality difference between Maresca and Guardiola. And from Maresca's point of view, he's obsessed with that Cruyffian philosophy. So Chelsea are going to get quite a forthright coach who prioritizes one-on-one management, whereas Pochettino was quite collective and inclusive to the group. So on day one, Pochettino threw a barbecue for everyone to get to know them, to set the tone, and that was for non-playing staff. Whereas Maresca wants one-on-one meetings and he wants to really get into the in-depth tactical talk with players from youth all the way up to first team. So even before he got the Chelsea job, his thirst for knowledge was something that stood out. He was on holiday in Marbella. He'd watched a bunch of Chelsea games. So by the time he spoke face-to-face with the sporting directors, Lawrence Stewart and Paul Winstanley, they were blown away by his knowledge of the club and his plan going forwards. And that was one of the reasons why he became a standout candidate. Thomas Frank was the other one that came close, and Kieran McKenna was in the process too. With McKenna, my understanding is there's kind of two sides to the story. So Chelsea had some reservations about McKenna's inexperience, but the fact McKenna signed a new Ipswich deal before even waiting to see what happens at Manchester United tells you from his perspective, he was convinced to stay at Ipswich. So the McKenna camp would probably say it was his decision and he wanted to stay at Ipswich. And if he didn't, then he would have continued negotiating with Brighton or waited for Manchester United, even if nothing transpired with Chelsea. Whereas Chelsea's perspective is they ruled out McKenna, and they did so in a very classy way, and they made a direct phone call. And that left Frank and Maresca in the process. And Frank can feel a bit hard done by because he lost out due to the fact that his style was seen as less possession-based and more defensive. But ultimately, if Frank was given Chelsea's tools, you would expect him to have more possession and you would expect him to play a more attacking style. So it's kind of hard to project Frank at Chelsea.
It certainly,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it is because Thomas Frank, I feel, has done this thing where I think he would want to play more possession-based football, more attractive football, because Brentford do that at times. But he has a philosophy of, well, if I'm going up against a team that's better on the ball than me and got better players, I'm going to be a little bit more pragmatic. I'm going to be a little bit more calculated, and he'll sit back and he'll absorb a little bit more. So that there is a thought process of, well, you don't have an out-and-out philosophy that you never yield from, where Enzo feels very much, I'm going to play a bit like Big Ange. I'm going to play this way no matter who's available, no matter what's going on at the club. And this does seem to be a bit of a toss-up amongst fans, clubs, football people at large, to what they prefer, someone that's a bit more malleable or someone that is just very stringent in how they play.
Yeah, I think it's also about a fit in Chelsea's model, and it's difficult sometimes when you're hiring somebody that has played a defined style in a very unique model like Frank, that's data driven and has had key players out like Ivan Toney to tell exactly how they transition. So Frank scored very highly on personality and on football philosophy, but less so in terms of the possession-based game and compared to Maresca. So not entirely and not taken in isolation, but comparative to Maresca, was seen as more defensive. But the other thing as well is just with Maresca, Chelsea feel that not only did he overperform at Leicester, and I know that might sound strange to some because Leicester were favourites to go straight back up into the Premier League, but he overperformed stylistically and in terms of the marginal gains that he got out of certain players. And also they felt that at Leicester, from their due diligence, the style Maresca plays was a culture shock to a bunch of relegated players and new signings with championship pedigree, and some of them experienced in the Premier League. But that style was different. And Chelsea's hierarchy, from their due diligence, believed that the Leicester squad bought in pre-season, and several weeks in, they reflected a clear identity, more so than Frank and Brentford. And that was a factor. And it may sound strange because 4-3-3 is not a difficult system to get to grips with. But what you have to understand about Maresca's 4-3-3 is when teams attack, it's much more of a 3-2-5. So you have a goalkeeper who's arguably the most important player on the field and will come out his box and will join the back line. Then you have centre-backs who have to push further forwards and be quick. And Leicester centre-backs were not that fast, but Chelsea's are, especially for Fofana and Tosin, who's likely to come in. So that will help. Then the fullbacks are inverted, which will be interesting for Reece James in particular, and good news for Marc Cucurella, who was inverted under Maurizio Pochettino and was excellent playing in that role in the last 6 or 7 games of the season. Then your number 6s have to be quick passers and progressive where possible, and that should get the best out of Moises Caicedo and Enzo Fernandez. And then your number 8s are gung-ho. They need attacking output. And Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall at Leicester in midfield was excellent all season with double figures in goals and assists, which is obviously why he's in demand this summer. And then the other interesting point about the tactics is when you take those players, there's not much more room in midfield if you're going to play Enzo Fernandez, Moises Caicedo in a 4-3-3. So then does Cole Palmer play behind the striker, or does he go wide right? And if Palmer did play behind the striker, then Christopher Nkunku could go wide right, lead the line. But then what about Nicholas Jackson? And it's difficult for Chelsea fans, I think, to put in a perfect 11 in a 4-3-3.
Yeah.
Because the front line is slightly better suited on paper to that 4-2-3-1. And that is also because whereas Maurizio Pochettino may have been flexible and said, should a new striker come in, and we might speak about that for Chelsea in a moment, Nicholas Jackson could go as a wide forward, Cole Palmer could play as a wide forward, and Nkunku could play as a wide forward. Maresca is obsessed with wingers, which is good news for Mykhailo Mudryk. It's good news for Elise or Somerville if they end up joining Chelsea. But I don't see him playing a 4-3-3 with wide forwards. So the welcome headache is going to be fitting everyone into a 4-3-3. And it will be interesting to see how he does that. Because you know that Palmer's an automatic name on the team sheet. You would presume that Nkunku is also one. But as soon as you name those two, if you sign a flagship striker to lead the line, then somebody's going to be playing out of position.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that we've had a lot of conversations with Chelsea fans who, when you try and ask them and press them around who do you think will play, it's difficult. One of the reasons why I think Man United could sign Elise is where if they go for a 4-3-3 and Palmer's pushed out to the right, Elise's walks into the Man United team, in my opinion, where he maybe doesn't at Chelsea. And I think all these things are great considerations. On the transfers, there's a few